There we go. All right, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Coaching Agile Journeys. We have a interesting, different type of event today. It's not going to be so much a webinar and a one-way conversation, but we're going to be actually live taking questions. We have David Horowitz with us from Retrium. He's going to be answering those questions as we go. So a couple of housekeeping things. We have Slido is going to be our main way of managing our Q&A. So I have the link in the chat, and I'll post it several times throughout as new people join so they can get access to it. Right now we have a poll open. We'll look at that right before we start. So if you don't mind, go ahead and jump over into Slido, answer that poll question, and we'll look at it right here before I hand it over to David. So the Q&A is there. You can upvote questions you like, and we'll go through them. We can, and I hope we have a good conversation in the Zoom chat here. We normally do, as David's talking, you can post links in, you can chat back and forth. It's a pretty effective way for us to carry on the conversation. I do want to say that this is one of our final, for Coaching Agile Journeys, we're on a ramp towards the end of the year, but we still have a packed plan for all the events that we're going to have going forward. So I will remind you at the end, and I'll show you the ones coming up, but we have Mark Sheffield in October as our next webinar. And that's going to be a really great webinar. He's going to be talking about inviting leadership. If you've seen the book, he was a part of that. So I will put a link to Coaching Agile Journeys, the website, towards the end, so you can go and sign up for other events. But we're so glad y'all are here. And so David, welcome. Thanks for coming. I think we should probably, full disclosure, ever since this whole thing's been going on, not only is David a great connection in the community, but also now the guy that I report to. So he's Captain, my captain. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself, David, while I get the poll maybe up and running? Give us just your quick kind of intro for who you are.
Yeah, sure. So I am the CEO and co-founder of a company called Retrium. We help you run better Agile retrospectives. But my interest in retrospectives predates the company by far. I've always found it to be the core of agility, very seriously. Like, if you get the retrospective right, you get learning right, and learning is what agility is all about. So I've always been really passionate about them. And now, especially given what's going on in the world with COVID, they're 10 times harder than they ever used to be because we're all distributed. So how in the world do you do that effectively? So anyway, that's my professional side. I have 4 kids, one of whom is in the room right now back there. Yeah, living the dream. Thanks for having me, Isaac.
Yeah, so glad you're here. So I'm going to throw up our poll results, and you can keep answering that poll as you go. But there we go. By the way, everyone, I'm learning a Mac, so that's exciting. So far, the question was, what word comes to mind when you hear the word retrospective? And so we've got a handful here. And so what we'll do is, David, I'll let you maybe give some thoughts, maybe some reflection on this. And again, keep in mind, you can still answer the poll question if you're just joining us. But we'll go from here right over into our Q&A. So improvement seems to have captured people's minds. David, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good, promising thing, that's the word that people seem to coalesce around. The retrospective, of course, is intended to help your team improve, but it's also interesting to me because, we talk to people all day, every day about retrospectives, and there's always 3 problems that tend to pop up the most, every single conversation that we're in. So one of them is a lack of engagement. Another one is a lack of psychological safety and therefore a lack of honesty in the conversation. But the last one is connected to this word improvement or lack thereof, right? Which is, we run these retros, but nothing changes anyway. So how do we actually change as a result of the conversation? So I'm really thrilled to see that improvement is the word that comes to mind. I'd be really curious to see, is that actually happening for the people in the room, or is it just kind of a theory?
Awesome. Well, feel free to comment in the chat there about that. By the way, I'm going to switch over to our Q&A, and I'm not going to share my screen the entire one, but here for the beginning, I do want to show you the upvoted questions, and you can jump over to the Q&A at the link, or you can go to slido.com and put in E191. But these are the questions we're going to go through, and we will go through them in priority order based on your thumbs up and thumbs down. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and David, we'll just jump into some of these questions. But I would love to hear from you guys in the chat too, if you see success in your retrospectives. We have the intention of improving. Does it happen? Or does it maybe get lost somewhere in the journey? So, all right, David,
awesome.
well, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, so this to me, ideally, is not going to be an echo chamber because I talk about this stuff all the time. I've heard myself talk about this stuff all the time. So I would love this to be a conversation that is focused on based on what you all want to hear, which is why I like the Slido, because go in there, start upvoting the questions you want me to focus on so that I know what is most engaging to the group, which is actually ties back to retrospectives really closely, because one of the big problems around engagement with retros that we see all the time is people talk about things that people don't care about on the team, and so of course engagement is low. So I don't want that here. I want to be talking about what everyone here really wants to hear. So I'm going to pause before I jump into any of the questions to give you all, let's say, 30 seconds, just to read through a bunch of them and upvote the ones that you want to hear the most, so that we can focus it on the right stuff.
That's great. Cue the wonderful Jeopardy music. Do do do. This is where you wish you had one of those switcher boards. But
Yeah.
oh, all right, now they're all in Slido. Questions are over in Slido. So if you follow the link that I've posted in the chat, it'll take you over to a board. And I will stop the poll. That might be confusing people. I'll stop the poll so that we don't have multiple windows open. So the poll is stopped. So now you should just see Q&A over on the Slido board. You can put your questions in and you can upvote and downvote those questions. You have 10 more seconds. I'm seeing votes come in, so that's good. People have found the Slido board. All right. Ooh, I was just about to take the top question and another one flew to the top. So good call on waiting a second. All right, let's jump in, David. So question number one for you. How do you track, hey, how did this question get to the top? It's almost like you loaded it or something. How do you track action items from the retro? Is it okay to bring it in the sprint backlog?
Yeah. So the short and simple answer is sure. If it's effective for you, of course it's okay to bring it into the sprint backlog. I would be the last person to ever tell you to stop doing something that works for you. Now, the more complicated, nuanced answer, as we all like to say, is it depends, right? So there are certain types of action items that fit really well into your sprint backlog. For example, if you have something that will take a certain amount of time, is assignable to a certain individual or someone you know is really going to work on it. I'll give you an example. Let's say you're trying to get continuous integration up and running with your team. Well, maybe there's a spike you have to do to research different options for your continuous integration system. So you might have one or two engineers research that in the upcoming sprint. That will take a certain amount of time away from other potential product backlog items. So in that case, to me, that fits really nicely into your sprint backlog. It's a concrete task with an expected outcome that you can agree on in advance of the task. But there are also certain types of action items that would be, in my mind, much harder to fit onto the sprint backlog. So maybe things that are a bit more amorphous. I can come up with an example. Suppose you're having communication issues with stakeholders. And so as a team in your retrospective, you decide that once a day, at least once a day, we are going to talk with key stakeholder X. So just to make sure we get their feedback, or maybe it's the product owner. We want to make sure we're interfacing with the product owner at least once a day, whatever it is. Something like that doesn't really fit into your sprint backlog so much. How would you put it there? How would you estimate it? How would you get it to be boxed in? How do you know if it should be prioritized? It's a bit more complicated and doesn't seem to me to fit well. So in that case, you can store an action item in a different spot. And I like to say, as long as it's visual and just there for your team wherever they are, it's a good spot to store it. So for example, in that latter case where we're talking about, we should talk to the product owner at least once a day, what I might do to turn that action item into something more visual is, and I'm assuming non-COVID world, we're all in a team room, if physically co-located, right? There's a whole set of other problems with distributed. I'm gonna not go there right now. But you might take a poster board and put up a timeline for your 2-week sprint, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday for the 2 weeks, and have a box above each one. And every time you talk to the product owner, just put a little tally mark so that visually you can track your progress across time in line with the sprint in a location the team is already living in and working in and looking at. It doesn't have to be in your backlog then, it can be somewhere else. So use your judgment. I think if by default it's where you already are looking, you're in a good spot. And for some of you, that's the backlog. And for other of you, that might not be.
That's awesome. That kind of sounds a bit like a habit tracker, right? Like you get those things that you can, did I drink 8 glasses of water today? Or did I brush my teeth, right? You can, whatever your habit you're trying to find, you're kind of doing that for the team. What habit do we want to build in and then helping them see it?
Yeah, important thing to me is that there's this concept of an impeccable agreement that comes from a book called The 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership, which is a fascinating book that's completely not in the Agile space, but I find a lot of the lessons there analogous to Agile in some ways. But they talk about impeccable agreements, which is the idea that any time that a set of people, two people or an entire team, agree to something, um, in many cases, if there's trouble with follow through, then it's because it's not clearly defined. And some people might assume one thing, someone else might assume something else. So you want to translate whatever that agreement is into what they call an impeccable agreement, something that's so well defined that everyone in the room knows exactly what it is, who's going to do it, when it's going to be done by. Sounds like a SMART goal from Agile, right? So these two concepts kind of parallel each other. But make it impeccable and make it so that the culture of the company or of your team is such that you know with 100% certainty if you have an impeccable agreement, it will get done. Like that's the culture. And if not, retrospect on that to figure out, well, why, right? So you can use that also in your retrospective action items, that concept.
Awesome. All right, thanks. Okay, so we'll jump into the next question then.
Isaac, before we jump to another one, can I
Yeah,
open it up? Like, does anyone else have an awesome
absolutely.
practice around this that they'd like to share? I'd like to hear.
Sure. So as I wrote, I'll turn on the video. As I wrote in the comment, what I'm used to do is to put the decisions that were made during the retrospective just on the board, and as a practice, after we go through all of the stories, how they progress and everything, the last thing is to track the decisions that were done there. So every day, if that would be the example, there's a question: did you talk yesterday to the product owner? Or did you manage to clean, I don't know what, clean this code base or something like that, just as a reminder for the team.
Great.
Yeah.
I love it. Anyone else?
I actually put in a comment here about we use Confluence after the retros, and if there are action items that come up, we track them there. And we visit them on a regular basis. If they're actionable and they do make sense to put on the backlog, we will do that. A lot of times it's, how we make improvements across the whole team or the whole organization and taking action items or bringing it to our leadership. So it kind of falls underneath it depends, as you mentioned, but we have had good luck with that because we go back and we can review them every few sprints and say, where are we at with this? Is this still an issue? Has it been fixed? Do we need to do something else? So that's kind of how we handle those.
Yeah, the theme I'm getting from this is put them where your team lives, right? So some people are saying Confluence, other people are saying Azure DevOps. Wherever you're going to look, so you remind yourself about them continuously throughout the sprint, is probably the right spot to put your action items.
Right. That's awesome. Yeah, make your intentions visible. David, somebody was asking for the book title. Vicky, actually, not just somebody, but Vicky was asking that you mentioned.
Oh, yeah, I can type it into the chat here. 1 second.
That'd be great. We do have some avid readers who have those wonderful book lists that they read. So there we go.
It's a fair warning. It is a little hippy dippy into the leadership world of things. You have to get the right mindset or be open to a little bit of hippy dippiness. Not that you have to follow what they say literally necessarily, because some of it is a little bit out there, but it does provide a different viewpoint on leadership than any other book I've ever come across, at least.
Very cool. All right. Thank you everybody for that participation too. This is great. This is what we want, an interactive opportunity here, and also to even follow up with David. So here we go. Moving on. How do we know we're striking the right balance between intra-team and cross-team improvement? And what are some techniques to focus a retro on the big picture?
Yeah, I don't know if the person who asked that question is on the call and can clarify what they mean by right balance. To me, that is a very context-sensitive term. So if there's any context you want to add here, that'd be great. Otherwise, I can give an answer, but I want to make sure I'm answering what you're asking.
That was Tim. It was in the comment. Tim, are you available to add some context to that? And he might not be. You might. Oh yeah, no mic. That's okay.
Okay.
He did say in the chat, we tend to neglect stuff outside of the team.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So it sounds like you're heavily weighted on the intra-team side and not enough weighted on the inter-team side. So there's a couple of things that you can do. So one thing is intentionally hold a cross-team retrospective. I mean, the word retrospective, first of all, predates Agile, and it certainly predates Scrum. It wasn't even part of the Scrum guide in the first iteration of it, right? So we tend to confuse, to a certain extent, the term retrospective with the term sprint retrospective, which is for the team, is not for cross-team. But there's no reason you can't hold these retrospectives at other times and other intervals with people beyond just your individual team. So if you're not focusing on the cross-team issues within your team, one simple solution is, well, then hold a cross-team retrospective, right? But if you want to hold a intra-team retrospective that focuses on the issues that fall outside the team, then that's a different question. So there's a couple of ways I can suggest doing that. One is, as the facilitator of the retrospective, one of the big decisions that you have to make is whether the retrospective is going to be broad or narrow. What I mean by that is, are you going to go into the retrospective, open up a blank canvas like a lean coffee, for example, and say, add your ideas to the board, we're going to upvote them and find some stuff to talk about. That's a broad retrospective. It could be about anything. And if the team seems to focus on intra-team issues, then perhaps you should go to a narrow retrospective where you actually set the context in advance of the retrospective of what you're going to focus on. For example, you could bring into the gather data phase of the retrospective, which one of the 5 phases of retro, I don't need to go into the detail, but bring data on, I don't know, maybe we have a quarterly target, business target that we're trying to achieve inside our company. We say, let's retrospect on this, like how are we doing against this goal? So now we're not just talking about our team, but the business. You could, for example, run what's called a team radar, which I don't know if people here are familiar with Team Radar, but basically all it is you come up with 5 to 7 different things that you want your team to rate themselves on from 1 to 5. And you ask everybody, go ahead, rate yourself from 1 to 5 on each of these different elements of your work. And then you can average the responses so that you can end up with a particular topic for the retro that has the lowest average of the 5 to 7 possibilities to make more tangible on that. If you wanted to focus on cross-team issues, maybe you had 5 to 7 things as the facilitator that you've seen are issues at cross-team level. You list them out and you ask people, how are we doing on these from 1 to 5? And then the team is going to tell you, this is the one we're doing the worst on. So then you run a retrospective on that. It also has the advantage of boosting engagement for your team, because if you're talking about things that the team doesn't care about, they won't be engaged. But if instead you're giving the team the opportunity to tell you, this is what we're rating ourselves the lowest on, then they're inevitably going to want to talk about it. So that's a side benefit. You could do one more thing here on Team Radar. You could do it on company values, for example. Like, which of these values are we not living up to the most? And then you end up almost always talking about cross-team systemic issues at your company instead of just things within the team. So there's some suggestions that come to mind. But again, I'd love to open it up and hear what everyone else is doing.
I'll just actually say, David, I ran across a group of Agile coaches at a company who just did that very thing. They were trying to say, are we being effective as coaches? And they ran a retrospective on, are we coaching the company effectively? And they used a Team Radar to really set the stage. And then from there moved on into, okay, let's dig deeper into how we can do better on some of these areas. But he said it worked really well for them as coaches, taking a really wide view of the entire company. Are we helping? And so, yeah, definitely seen that useful in the wild.
Can you use the Zoom, ask a question to everyone, use the Zoom thumbs up or hand icon or response or whatever you call them. If you don't know or haven't seen a Team Radar, can you just do that little hand thing? I'm going to show you what I mean. The reaction is what it's called, like this.
Yeah.
Or that. Any reaction if you have not seen or used Team Radar before. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's a bunch of people. Let me just show you a visual of what it looks like, and then we'll move on so that you can see it. Load this up. Okay, so share screen. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing.
All right, my bad. I'm on it. I got you. Should have made you a co-host
at
the beginning of this. Boom, there we go. You should now be co-host.
I see that. All right, excellent. So this is what it looks like. So how are your team's development practices is the prompt. And then we have testing practices, shared coding standards, managing technical debt, and so on. You can come up with your own labels, whatever you want to rate yourselves on. And then you average the responses. So this blue line is the average. So this one, for example, for this team has a 1.7 on managing technical debt. So then for the rest of the retrospective, the team would focus just on managing technical debt as a way to improve that. And what's really cool is across time, you can measure the impact of the retrospective, because you can see that managing technical debt went from a 1.7 to a 2 to a 2.5 and so on up the chain, or maybe it's not, in which case, what else could we do to try to improve it? So this is what a team radar looks like. It's a great way to start a retrospective if you want to narrow focus.
Excellent. So David, that kind of looks like, just from the coaching world, I know a few of us have kind of a coaching background, or at least are interested in that, kind of looks like the wheel of life in a way, right? That wheel of life exercise where you see where are you at on your, your family, your physical goals, your fun, your finances, and you kind of plot those points. It gives you that opportunity of where am I out of balance, and you can focus on that.
Yeah, very cool.
Excellent. Okay. Amber was asking for the categories in your example, what those were, if you could say those again.
Oh, sure. I can load that back up real quick and type them in here. So this is testing practices. That's one. Shared coding standards. That's two. Managing tech debt. Clarity of scope. Ability to focus. And deployment processes. But those are just for one team. That's what they wanted to rate themselves on. It's completely flexible as a tool, of course. And the view that I showed is on Retrium. So if you want to be able to run that, if you're a Retrium user, you can experiment with it there.
Awesome. All right. Okay, let's mark that one as complete. Good answer. And okay, I think our conversation on that is there. So next question. This one has the next most votes. Are retrospectives, classic. Our retrospectives turn into gripe sessions about DevOps or the lack of it, management, processes, all things beyond our control. How do we focus?
It's funny that this is the next one, because the last question was how do we focus on things that are beyond the team? And this one is how do we not focus on things that are beyond the team? So different teams have different problems. It's interesting that they parallel each other. Okay, so there's a couple of things that I would recommend here. First is it can be useful when teams talk about things outside of their control every single retrospective to use something called circles and soup, which Diana Larson talks about a lot, where you document what are the things out of our control in a visualization. So circles and soup is very simple. It has 3 concentric circles. The one in the center is things we control. The one in the middle is things we can influence. And the one on the outside is the soup, or just the things that are here in the way that we work, but we can't do anything about them. So when people in a retrospective talk about problems, instead of just jumping into discussion, first figure out where are they in that circles and soup diagram, and make this a living visualization for your team, where every time any issue or impediment or problem is discovered, it's placed up there on that diagram. Now, what that does for you is you can use that as a prompt, as a facilitator, to try to see how can we move things from one circle in a circle. So for example, if something is out of our control in the soup, you could run a retrospective on, well, how could we possibly move that from the soup to something we can influence? It provides a frame of mind for people to try to bring things into their circle of control instead of just assuming that they're not. And in my experience, at least, of course, there are some things that you literally have no control over, and no matter what you do, there's nothing you can change. But most things, 90%, if not more, there's at least something that you can do, even if it only fixes 15% of the problem. If you switch your mindset from that's out of our control to how can we bring it into our nexus of control? At a minimum, it's changing your response, right? You can change yourself. You can always control yourself, but usually there's something more than that. So circles and soup can be really helpful. Another thing that I'd recommend is to help your team get out of the mindset of we talk only about things that are beyond our control, is there's something called impact versus control mapping. So it's just a 2x2 matrix. It's nothing fancy. But if, let's say you've identified a problem that seems out of your control, you can ask your team, well, let's come up with 20 different potential solutions to this problem. And I'm going to put up a diagram on the board where on the y-axis we have impact, high, low. And on the x-axis, we have control, in our control, out of our control. And whenever you come up with a potential solution to this problem, just put it up there on the diagram wherever it fits. And what you'll do is two things. So one is you'll help people think through, well, what is in our control that has a high impact? And the second is there will be disagreement on the team where a potential solution should be placed. And in that disagreement, you'll end up with conversation that wouldn't have happened otherwise about how can we shift it over to something in our control more. You can also do that around problems, so not just solutions. So whenever you come up with a list of problems for that the team's facing, map it, impact versus control. And so you end up focusing the rest of the retrospective on the problems that are most in our control and have the potential for highest impact if we were to fix them. This is a great way of kicking off your retro too in the discovery phase.
Excellent. So I think maybe open it up, see if anybody else has any suggestions
always.
on this one.
Definitely.
Yeah. How to avoid gripe sessions. You can respond in Zoom with a hand up. Anybody experienced those gripe sessions? I know that I've experienced those before where the team, I'll say this, one thing I've noticed at teams that I've done that with, I've found, David and others, that sometimes teams who've been doing Scrum for a year or some kind of agile framework kind of start to sit back and be like, we've got this down. We can't do anything else. All the problems are beyond us. We've got it figured out. And sometimes there's a need for maybe a bit of a deeper understanding of some of the practices because, a little bit of maybe hubris sets in and they start thinking they're better than maybe they are as a team.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes that can lead to everything out there is terrible. Everything in here is perfect. We are great. They're the problem. That can also lead to some of those gripe sessions too.
Yeah, so that's a great example of how bringing something into your nexus of control can be really powerful. So for example, if you're complaining about something in your organization, it's just not going well and everyone's griping about it, switching that to, well, who can we talk to about this to actually try to affect change as opposed to just griping can be really helpful. So many teams will run these retrospectives and they complain about stuff outside of their control, but don't actually take action to try to fix it. And it's not in your control. You can't guarantee a change, but you can certainly let others know. I mean, it's entirely possible that management, for example, has no idea that 75% of their teams are experiencing the same problem. They might just not know. So if at the end of the retrospective, you ask your team, well, what out of everything we just discussed should we intentionally tell others in the organization? All right, bye, Mark. Thanks for stopping by. But what can we tell others in the organization that they might not know is a great way to close the retrospective. But make sure it's opt-in and volunteer because you don't want to expose people or violate psychological safety in the room. But if people agree, yeah, we should talk to people about this, it changes gripe into action.
That's awesome. And I love that you called out opt-in and volunteer. So we actually have a sub question that came in that someone messaged me that I think is really good maybe to open up for discussion here. Is it okay to let the team vent? And then how do you even know how much time to linger? You don't want to linger there for a long time, but is it okay to allow them some space to vent? And then maybe how do you know when it's time to, okay, now let's stop venting and let's move into solving? What's your take on that balance?
Of course, people are emotional and they sometimes need to vent to get it off their chest. This is perfectly fine. As long as it doesn't descend into personal attacks that stem from fear and stem from anger. And it's more, we just need to talk about this to gripe and then we can move on to action. That's perfectly acceptable. There's usually a sign that as you facilitate these retrospectives more and more often, you'll pick up on. Let people gripe and eventually you'll hear when they've released that feeling of frustration into the room. When you start hearing it's time to move on. People are ready now to switch mindset from complaining to action.
That's so interesting. And so you're talking about a little bit of level 3 listening there, like listening to the environment of the room.
Yeah.
So here's a question for you, make it a little tricky. How do you do that while remote and people are sitting on mute? How do you know when the right time is to advance from there?
I'm going to put myself on mute. Could you see it?
I saw it.
It's not audio, it's visual. It's more visual than audio. You might not hear the deep breath, even if you're in person, but you can visually see it on their face, in their body, the way that they are acting in the room. And that's how you know, really. Video is important. If you don't have video on, it becomes much more challenging.
Dov wanted to make it really challenging, so
yeah,
no video.
Yeah, with no video, I mean, Here's the thing. You can try to run a retrospective with no video, and I understand and I am empathetic with the fact that there are legitimate reasons why you might not be able to turn video on, but it's really hard because so much of these critical conversation has to do with body language and has to do with being able to see people. And when you don't have video, for me, it can be very challenging to understand and get a sense of the room.
Yeah, go ahead, Dov. Yeah.
So one thing I do is to define formally that the first 10 minutes are a venting session. So, and if they stop after 5, say, come on, you can do better than that. Like, make formal space for venting.
I like that. I like that a lot. And then you know when it's time to move on because you're watching the clock and saying, if anybody had more good ones, you got 30 seconds left, come on. And then we move on. We vented and we move on. Thanks, Dov, for sharing that. Awesome.
Does anyone else have something to share on this one?
Yep. Okay, we'll roll on. Mark that one as discussed. Next question. What are some fun and creative ideas around making the retro more engaging? Back to what you talked at during the intro, actually.
Yeah, I have a bit of a conformist or non-traditional viewpoint on this. So if you ask almost anyone else, the answer that you typically will get is, well, here are some fun activities or games you can play or different. I am not a believer in that. So I'm going to just full disclosure, that's not the world that I'm coming from. In my experience, that doesn't actually boost engagement in what you're trying to get at in a retrospective, which is continuous improvement. It might improve engagement in the activity, but that isn't that helpful. So I'm going to come at this from a very different angle, which is probably many of you have heard of 5 whys, which is just to ask why many times until you get to the root cause of the issue. I start there when there's low engagement, because there's usually a reason. Why. And if you just are throwing darts at the wall of, well, I'm going to try this new activity to boost engagement, it's very likely you're not going to pick something that actually solves the real fundamental problem the team is experiencing. So start with 5 whys. So for example, you might discover that, I don't know, it's something simple. The team is running a retrospective at an inconvenient time because maybe you have some people in India and some people in the US and it's just not working. So now you have something real. Well, the reason it's not engaging is because it's inconvenient for people. So how can we solve that? You've translated lack of engagement into a more tangible, specific problem. Another one might be, again, we're talking about things that don't matter. We touched on this before. We're talking about all these things that just is not going to change my life that much here at work. Well, how can we fix that? Maybe we should use dot voting. Maybe we should use team radar. Maybe we should make sure that we do I don't know, some way of voting to make sure the right topics bubble up, but you're solving the actual problem. Now, the most common answer that I get when I run 5 whys on lack of engagement has to do with lack of follow through. So what I mean by that is a retrospective that actually leads to action and change that improves people's lives is almost by definition engaging, because why wouldn't you want to do that? I don't care if you're the most skeptical person on earth. If something is improving your life, you will continue to do it. The problem is the lack of follow through, 75% of the time. So translate lack of engagement to lack of follow through, and now we have a whole different world of things we can experiment with. So stop worrying about the activities and start worrying about, well, how do we make sure we follow through on this in the sprint? Make sure that you're working on something that is important to the team, that is small enough that you can actually follow through on, and then do it. And if you can tie the retrospective to whatever that small improvement was and make that very clear to your team, then it's natural the next time they come to the retrospective for them to be more engaged. So again, this is non-traditional. Most people wouldn't tackle the problem this way, but to me, it's the only way to fix engagement is to discover what the root cause is, because lack of engagement is not the root cause, it's a symptom of the problem.
That's awesome.
Now I'll get off my high horse or soapbox on that one, but I just think that the Agile industry does us a disservice with the focus on fun activities and games.
Anybody else, any thoughts adding to that or things that you found effective for engagement?
I'd love to hear someone tell me that they think I'm wrong, by the way, because it'd be really interesting to hear what's working for you other than that to boost engagement in your retro.
Anybody?
Engagement on what level? It's engagement during the meeting or engagement about doing something? And also, like the question that I put in the chat is fun for whom? Like there's a lot of fun engagements that might be very fun for the facilitator, but not really for the team. And this is a very big demotivator. So what I prefer is to do some unusual activity that is linked with the retrospective. So not do something fun that is just an energizer, but to do something that is linked to a problem that exists in people's lives.
I'm getting fantastic comments from Coke in the chat. So I think there are loads of value in fun activities. Great. Depends where and how you use it. Depends on what the team needs. And I've experienced amazing value in it in my experience. So that's great. There is, let me clarify what I was saying. It's not that fun activities are necessarily, in my opinion, wrong in and of themselves. It's that they should be solving some root issue. And if they do, then they're fantastic to use.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would add that sometimes changing the approach gets different things out. Like we did this Three Little Pigs retrospectives where it was like House of Straw, House of Sticks, House of Bricks, like where it kind of changes everybody's perspective on like what's the solid stuff that we're doing versus what's not working. And I think changing the approach sometimes can get a little bit more out of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another good example of this is there's certain people who like the creative type retro where we're building with Legos or we're drawing how our feeling was around the sprint. And then there's certain types of people who would just rebel against that and just want to look at the data and analyze it from a very factual perspective. So if the lack of engagement is because of different personalities types on the team around that, then yeah, switching up the activity to be sometimes more on the creative side will boost engagement. And that's wonderful. And absolutely should do that.
I do a lot of variety as well, because sometimes I have some team members that are a little more introverted and some that are a little more extroverted. So I try and do different things to help draw more out of the different personality types. So I think variety is always a good thing.
Yeah. And Dove said liberating structures are awesome to try. Yeah. 100%. And this connects back to, sorry, I didn't catch the name of the person who just said introverts, extroverts, but whoever that was, I think liberating structures can really help with that. 1, 2, 4, all, for example. Some people feel really comfortable in a large group setting and not in a one-on-one, but other people are the opposite. So switching that up can give people different forums in which they might be comfortable or uncomfortable, and that boosts engagement.
Awesome. Also, Amber threw out there as well in the chat using themes around the retro, and so tying in some kind of a theme to kind of change your perspective back to Erin's point, right, and to make it fun. She's found that to work too, which seems cool. Have a theme for the sprint. I'm going to put the since someone mentioned liberating structures, so some of you might not be familiar with that. Put the link to that in the chat there. So, ask team members to facilitate.
Mm-hmm.
That can raise engagement. People get tired of hearing you as a facilitator, but now you put one of their peers as a facilitator or themselves, interest goes up.
Can also boost empathy for just how hard it really is.
That's true. That's very true. I was actually just listening to a book on military leadership. Jocko Willink wrote it, the guy who wrote Extreme Ownership. And he actually has a chapter on if you have a problem with someone who's causing problems in your command, look to find a place of leadership and responsibility, because it can, like you said, boost empathy of, boy, this leadership thing's not that easy, and also put some of the weight on their shoulders, and
mm-hmm.
They can see value in, oh, I need to own this or else it doesn't get owned. So I explained that poorly. The book is great, but I explained that poorly. Okay, let's move on to our next question. This is great. How do I know if a retrospective has been successful, David?
Okay, so I have an answer here, but I would love to hear from others first before I bias the conversation. So does anyone else have a thought here of how do you know if you had a successful retro?
For me, it's if people feel excited about our action plan. Like it feels more hope that things are actually going to change and get better. That's, for me, that's how I know it's a success.
Okay,
Yeah.
it was, oh, go ahead, Aaron.
I was even going to add to that, when you see outcomes, when you see continuous improvement outcomes from the team after the next sprint.
Maybe one more.
Yeah, in fact, I would start the retro by asking people, how will you know that this retro was successful?
Yeah, love it. So my answer to that is around learning as opposed to improvement, in the sense that I have been a part of retrospectives that led to an action item that then everyone was very confident about, we'll fix the problem. And then we're in the sprint and we try it and it does the exact opposite. It actually made things worse. But to me, that retrospective was still very successful because it reduced the possible solution set by 1 and increased the learning by 1. And that's a success. So to me, it's all about learning. And more specifically, the whole team has to learn something that can be turned into action. So actionable team learning could be the lingo there. But as long as you have learned something that might help your team, not that it will, then that's a success to me.
Awesome.
Actually, I think there's something there too around helping teams arrive at consensus around an action item to take on too. I know this is not one of the questions, but a lot of teams struggle because you have strong personalities, right? So one person says, no, I think this is the right action. Another person says, no, I think this is the right action. So what in the world do you do? And if you're trying to figure out the solution, then of course there'll be disagreement. But if instead you're just trying to figure out a potential solution or an experiment, then even if I'm wrong, we've learned something. And so it lessens the barrier to agreement. And it's like consent-based decision-making as opposed to consensus-based decision-making, where you might disagree, but I consent to it happening because we're going to learn something, will be helpful in helping the team get agreement on what they'll work on.
And a great tool for that is, if you're not familiar with it, you might Google fist to 5. So everybody, it's easier in a room than on a Zoom call, but if you have a video, the old fist to 5, right, where as long as we can support this as a team, right? You don't have to have perfect everyone of 5, but as long as you're at the level where everyone feels comfortable supporting it, then you can move on. Yep, as opposed to having perfect consensus.
And I'll share one more link, which is the decider.app, which talks about different decision-making models that you can use. I think they list 8 or 9 or 10 of them, and then asks you questions around what are you trying to solve, and helps you pick the right decision-making model based on your situation. It's very, very simple and very helpful.
That's an awesome link. Thank you for sharing that. That's going in my toolbox, my online toolbox.
It's a good one, yeah.
Excellent. All right. Anybody else? Any feedback for this question before we move to the next one? Success from a retro? Excellent. Doing a quick time check. We've got 17 minutes left, so we want to make full use of that. How do I sell retrospectives in my company where we have more work than time and everyone claims to be too busy to meet to reflect?
Yeah. I guess it depends on who's doing the complaining, or who is the person who is saying we don't have enough time. I think that how you sell something depends on who you're selling to. So if it's a manager or it's an executive, my answer would be different than if it's a team member. So if maybe the person who asked this question can provide some context.
Or anybody, maybe.
Or
Anybody
anyone, yeah.
out there? Yeah, want to provide context to this? It was anonymous, so I don't have a name for the person who submitted this one.
When I see questions like that, I kind of think about that. So I'm too busy to take care of myself and eat healthy and go to the gym,
Yeah.
but I'm not too busy to go to the doctor and or have test run or something like that. So I kind of twist it around and ask them that. So you know something needs to be fixed, and ignoring the problem does not make it go away. So do you want to just keep ignoring the problem, or do you want to let's see if we can find a way to make it go away?
Yep. Yeah, and
Gail,
that could be.
Go ahead, David.
I mean, that could be another symptom of the fact that when you run retrospectives, or when that individual has run retrospectives in the past, it hasn't led to continuous improvement. And in that case, I'm actually really sympathetic with them, because why would you want to participate in a meeting that isn't helpful? It's logical to say, no, I'm opting out. So the onus is on you to figure out how to fix that and get to a point of continuous improvement then.
That's where we found if we actually showed them the actions are being taken,
Yeah.
they get much more hyped up about it than if it just goes down into the proverbial black hole. So that's when we take those actions, or we get it assigned, or we escalate it up the channel, or whatever that means. We typically find that they are much more engaged and more willing to throw, I call them the ugly babies, out on the table. And they will start throwing them out more because they know someone's listening and we really are trying to help them.
Yeah, and if someone like that is coming back and saying, I don't want to participate in a retrospective, take them to lunch or coffee and ask, is everything perfect here, or is there anything to improve on? I mean, not in that way, right? But to have a natural, organic conversation to try to discover that. And almost always they'll say, well, I wish this would change, or I wish that would change. We say, great, well, why don't we have a conversation about that with the team? Well, bingo, you just are running a retrospective, but not in that name. And so sometimes avoiding the name, if there's a negative connotation with it, that can help people buy into the process. Nice. But again, my answer would be different if it's an executive or a manager, because that's a different problem. So I'm not sure if that's what they were going for, but then it would be more, how do you translate this into dollars and cents and the time savings, the productivity gains of retros, different type of answer.
So I think when I see this, and I think on my experience, the thing that this reflects on for me is I see a team with a manager who's a very micromanaging, command and control, and they've got, bosses who have put timelines on them that the team had no voice in saying, and so they turn around and tell the team, deliver this by this date, and the team knows that's a nights and weekends assignment, but the boss said so. We've done heroics in the past before. This is what we have to do to keep our job. And so everyone's running around, not intentionally ignoring retros because they don't see value, but basically saying, if I stop running, right, I'm not going to hit the arbitrary imposed deadline, which is a totally different problem, having a leadership structure that imposes deadlines like that.
Does anyone else have anything to add to this one?
There's a great image there that Aaron shared of someone offering circle wheels to people pushing a cart with square wheels, and they're saying, nope, we're too busy, don't have time for that. That's the reality, right? If you don't stop for a pit stop because you're trying to win the race, what happens? Your tires blow up. Sharpen the saw, right? 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Okay, let's go to the next one. And we're good. We might be able to fit, actually, we might be able to get all these in, maybe. How long should a regular retrospective last, David?
I assume regular means sprint retrospective, although again, it doesn't have to. There's different opinions about this. The Scrum Guide, at least, is somewhat specific. It says it's at most a 3-hour meeting. It's in most cases, it's shorter. I believe it says something to that effect. Different coaches will say different things. For example, I've heard a rule of thumb is 30 minutes for each week length in your sprint. So if you have a 2-week sprint, you get an hour. If you have a 4-week sprint, you get 2 hours. The question, though, to me is it's more important to get to effectiveness than to time. So I would start with a smaller time box and see if it's effective, because, of course, if you can be effective in a smaller amount of time, why not? And then expand the time until you get to the point of effectiveness, as opposed to saying we need to run this for 2 hours. So to be more concrete there, if you're struggling with follow through, which many of us are, then run your retrospective in a narrow way on a single problem and come up with a single solution to that problem or an experiment to that problem. And that's the amount of time you need for your retrospective. And don't go on and talk about the next 10 top topics or the next 20 topics and come up with 10 to 20 action items. Focus on one thing, but have a deep conversation about it, right? Really dive deep and try to figure out what is the most effective thing we can do to fix this. And whatever length that is would be a great amount of time for your retrospective.
And David, when you say effective, does that just go right back to our previous conversation, whatever create success for the team? Is that really what you're looking for? Let's find how much time we need to create success.
Yeah, so ideally you're coming up with one action item or one experiment, depending on your lingo, sure. But yes, that would be a learning or a solution or whatever your success criteria is, yeah. But I think a rule of thumb is about 30 minutes per week in the sprint.
Anybody else? Any other feedback from anyone before we move on? So the next one's very closely tied to time in a sprint, and it is, we have a 4-week sprint. So currently we're doing 1 retro a month. So they're doing monthly sprint and 1 retro a month. Do you think it'd be good to do 1 retro every 2 weeks instead of once a month?
Okay, so this goes back to the fact that retrospectives are not synonymous with sprint retrospectives. So yes, at a minimum, you should be doing it at the end of your 4-week sprint because that's the end of your time box for your sprint. But that doesn't preclude you from doing it at other times. I wouldn't even say every 2 weeks necessarily. One, you could do it more frequently than that. So to understand why, I mean, imagine, I don't know, there's problems your team's experiencing and you're putting them up onto a continuous improvement board somewhere, a visualization of all of the problems that we're facing, and they're collecting over time. And you see something there that is really important for your team to fix. Well, why wait for 2 weeks to fix it or 4 weeks to fix it? Why not retrospect now, right when we discovered it? So run them as frequently as is needed for your team to remove impediments, the larger impediments, and continuously get more productive and better at working together. There's a concept from Kanban that applies here, which is this continuous improvement of moving things from the left to the right in the Kanban board. So always have something that you're working on that you're continuously improving. And if you have the bandwidth to work on something else, retrospect now to figure it out. Don't wait, right?
Yeah. Awesome. All right, anybody else? Any other feedback on that? I love, by the way, the distinction of Scrum versus you can just have a retrospective. That's a great distinction. I'm glad you called that out. Okay, well, this is great. Last question over in the Slido, and then we might just see if we have any open questions because we'll have like time for one more after this. But last one on the Slido, how do you plan or schedule actions for a team that adds many of them for each retrospective? So I read this as they add a lot in each retrospective. How do you plan or schedule those? If you get a lot of action items.
It's a simple answer. Don't add that many. Instead of trying to budget for the time for all of those action items, don't create all those action items. It's hard enough as a human being to change anything. We're all kind of stuck in our ways, just naturally who we are. Even if we have a continuous improvement mindset, it is hard to change. So don't take so much into your continuous improvement backlog. Just have one thing to work on and scope it down so it's really manageable and small and something that actually gets done, so that retros lead to continuous improvement, so that they become more engaging going forward. It's one big cycle that builds on each other. So narrow scope, limit WIP,
Yes. Excellent. All right. I'll pause here for a second to see anybody have any follow-on or maybe even an additional question. We have time for one more question before we move into our close. Yeah, go ahead, Dov.
Yeah, so it's not a question, it's more of a thought. The focus of this hour is that retrospectives are meant for creating action items and following up for improvement, action items, experiments, whatever. For me, the main goal of a retrospective is not at all this. It's a way to let the team breathe, look in the mirror and connect to itself, to do self-healing, to let space for things that have no names to happen. And this is something we didn't discuss at all here.
So how would you judge success around that, Dov?
As I said, that's why I like to ask in the beginning of a meeting, how would you define this meeting as a success? Because what I want, in fact, there's a great practice. If let's say you have a question for the team, how do you feel or what do you want to improve? You take all of the team in a circle and you leave one empty chair. The empty chair is the team. And after everyone express what they want to improve, you ask if anyone wants to sit in the team chair and ask what do you think that the team wants to improve. And exercises like this, regardless of whatever is said in that chair, make the team more conscious that it's a team and not a collection of people. Okay, and this is, for me, the big exercise that you do in a retrospective is to help the team emerge as a team and not to help this collection of individuals work more efficiently.
I love it. This is why, to your point, Dov, you might ask the team, what do you want to accomplish in this retrospective, to make sure that you as a facilitator are aligned with the goals of the team.
Supporting the team, yeah. Yeah. Awesome.
Not only this, to pitch this idea to the team. As a facilitator, I'm part of the system. them. I'm not only an observer. I also have my own sneaky interest, right? By putting this chair in the circle, I already implement part of my sneaky, my devious intention, right?
I like that.
I believe Amazon is famous for this, but they leave a chair for the customer in all of their meetings.
That's
Same
great
same reasoning. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, guys. Well, we'll start to wind this thing down, and some of you have meetings right after this, so we'll get you some time to take a quick break between that. But I do want to say, David, thank you so much for coming on and answering these questions. Everybody in the comments, by the way, all participants, we had about 30 people here today. Great comments, not only when we answered questions, but in the comment box, the chat box. If you want the links and the things that are there, there's 3 dots above the chat. You can click those 3 dots and actually download the text file of the chat so you can keep those links. I've actually got 10 tabs open. I'm going to go read now after we're done here. But thank you, everyone, for your participation. I love it. I do want to extend an invitation to all of you. Go to coachingagilejourneys.com. Our next event is a lean coffee on Monday in October. We're actually going to have to move the date. That date, the 12th, has to move. But you can sign up for it. You'll get an email when we move it. But sign up for that virtual lean coffee. It's very similar to this format. We do a lean coffee. We upvote the topics we want to talk about, and we talk about them for an hour, all Agile related. So I'd love for you to join us there. And then remind you, Mark Sheffield is coming up October 19th. And so that's going to be a great talk on inviting leadership. So some of these same ideas we discussed here, Mark is going to share that with us. So again, thank you everyone for joining. David, special thank you for being here with us. And everyone stay safe, and we'll see you guys all at a future event. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Oh, and stay effective. Yeah, Tom, I like that.